Welcome to the New Mason Jar with Cindy Rollins, where we explore the atmosphere, discipline, and life of a Charlotte Mason education for all. Our hope is that you will be inspired to enter the large room Charlotte spread before us and find peace, hope, and joy in your educational endeavors, however imperfectly.
And this is exactly what I had inflicted on myself in Sardinia. The distance between me and the landscape had been erased. I had been reduced to an experience of pure elemental conditions, and I loved it because I was no longer a tourist. I was local, more than local. Its ecosystem had been written onto my body. After multiple hours in that sun-bleached wilderness, I had come to value water like those plants out there. I was no longer human. I was a lizard, a Mediterranean salamander. I had shed 87% of my rationality and loved doing so. Why? Because the gap between what I saw out there and what I held within had begun to close. I was being reunited, as Lewis put it, with something in the universe from which I had been alienated before. That is from my How to Die in Sardinia, which is one of the chapters of Why Literature Still Matters.
And listener of the New Mason Jar, you just heard Jason Baxter reading a quote from his own book. Hi, Cindy. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and I'm very excited because in our Patreon, starting in January, our monthly meeting, we're going to be doing this book for a few months, Why Literature Still Matters, Beauty After the Apocalypse. And we've gotten to read it ahead of time. We very much love it, and we know the Patreons are going to love it. So if anybody's interested in joining us, you can go to patreon.com/Cindy Rollins, and you can find it. It's also called Morning Time for Moms. But today we're just so excited to have Jason with us to talk about this new book. Welcome to the New Mason Jar, Jason.
Thank you so much. Really grateful to be here.
Well, before we go much further, let me give a little introduction about Jason. Jason M. Baxter is a college professor, translator, and author of 7 books, including The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, a new translation of Dante's Inferno, and now Why Literature Still Matters. He also writes about the role of the arts in our technological world on his Substack, Beauty Matters. He is currently the executive director of the Center for Beauty and Culture at Benedictine College in Kansas. Welcome to the New Mason Jar, Jason.
Thanks.
Jason, when I knew I was going to like your book, I just knew ahead of time because I liked your other book that I had read, and the Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. And I talked to you on the Literary Life podcast.
I remember.
I read this book, and at first I was a little worried. I thought it's going to be over my head. It's going to be difficult. And it was so readable. So I just want to lay that out there for people right now. It is a wonderful book. I enjoyed every minute of it. I have so many thoughts. I'm probably not going to be able to gather them because it was just so rich and thoughtful. But I'm so pleased that you wrote it. Thank you for writing it.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember this line from one of the philosophers I was reading in grad school sticks in my brain. Everything that can be said clearly. And I know I have muttered that to myself over many sort of boring academic texts, like everything that can be said clearly, right? Come on, you can rewrite this. Yeah. So that makes me happy. It seems like if you hope to write something that will touch hearts. You hope to write something that will change lives. You hope to write something that will be memorable and beautiful and make people laugh at the same time. And then to do it with absolute clarity, because if it can be said, it can be said clearly. So I'm glad that we have your testimony to prove it, Cindy.
Yeah. So on our podcast, we talk a lot mostly all the time about Charlotte Mason. Do you have any familiarity with Charlotte's ideas?
A little bit. I mean, not as much as you pros, but a little bit. Yes. I mean, we have homeschooled our kids on and off and used a variety of systems and sort of eclectic things. And so, yes, for what I know, I understand and appreciate just the centrality of the narrative, right?
Right.
Wow.
Everything you said about literature fits so much in actually the theme of our podcast because we really concentrate a lot on the disintegration of language and the importance of reading old books to our children so that they don't lose that. And you cover that so well in this book.
Mm.
I agree. I thought that Jason was speaking your love language the whole time I was reading his book, Cindy. It's really great. And Jason, I'll say that I've only about halfway through one of your books, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, and I love it. The tone of this one is even so much more relatable. That one does have more of an academic. I mean, it's not for an academic
Right.
only, but it
Right.
does have more of an academic tone
Right.
in the way it's presented. And this, I just felt like it was a conversation about cultural issues and things that matter and things that are important to, as Cindy mentioned, things that we discuss all the time. So it was really a delight to read.
Well, thank you. I think that's very intuitive of you because I think this was one of the books that I gave myself permission to write in the way that I actually write sort of naturally, and that is I always write for live audiences. My best ideas are always developed in anticipation of writing for actual people if they have a question which is important to them, and so these were a couple of things that I wrote and had never intended to string together into a book. They were just individual reflections, as I sometimes jokingly call it. They're individual stars in the sky. And for me, what happens is I write these individual things, and if they're good enough and I like it, it feels to me like I've said something that matters. But then all of a sudden, sometimes there's a fun moment in which you step back and realize that these individual stars make a constellation. But what I've discovered is I can't go the other way around. I can't tell my brain, all right, brain, you're going to write a book on this and it's going to have this many chapters. Now go do it. I get terrible writer's block when I do that. I have to just sort of scrap all plans and write individual things that feel meaningful and weighty to me at the time, and then just say, you know what? I don't know if it'll ever turn into anything more than this particular thing. So these are, I think the chapters that make up this book that come to find out do tell a story, and they do tell this narrative. I call it the sort of the story of the two islands, right? The warm, maybe even too warm island of Sardinia, where I almost died of dehydration, and weirdly, paradoxically loved it, and thus because I discovered what C.S. Lewis meant by loving literature while I was at it. And then the cold, sort of apocalyptic, depressing, geyser erupting landscape of Iceland. And so the book sort of tells those two stories. But the fun part is that I think these have been my most successful, well-received live talks to audiences. So I think what you're tuned into, Dawn, is that these books were written basically in the sort of way that people could follow them live, with the ear in presence. And I think that sort of just helps with the whole kind of digestion and comprehension because it's meant to be experienced in real time.
Well, that absolutely comes through because what tuned me into wanting to read your Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis was listening to your podcast with Angelina and Thomas and Cindy on the literary life, and then other talks that you've given. And as I was reading the book, it's still wonderful. I love it and I'm learning so much, but it didn't sound like you talking. So when I read Why Literature Still Matters and it does sound like you're talking to me, I'm all the more pleased. So do more of that, Jason. You can do the other stuff too, but do more of this too.
All right, we're giving me permission. We're giving my brain permission to work the way that it naturally wants to.
Please
Well,
do.
I hate to tell you this, Jason, but that is what Charlotte Mason would say. She says that education is the science of relations, and her approach to writing is through narration, which is letting your own mind make the connections. Whereas, like a lot of times, you have these writing programs that give kids these, very strict frameworks. And Charlotte didn't think that. She thought that the mind would create its own framework as it spent a lot of time reading and processing and writing. You have to do the work, but the work doesn't
Mhm.
have to be in a very strict box. And
If you internalize enough sort of narratives, you begin to develop the capacity to do your own constellation finding, like I was describing, huh? Yeah.
absolutely. I find that all the time that comes to play. People will say, "Oh, what you said was so amazing." And I'm like, I don't even know where that came from because
Hmm.
it came from a bunch of thoughts that pulled themselves together. Um, from the mind, and
Hmm.
that's the way she said our minds are, because we're made in the image of God. We take in ideas, and those ideas excite us, and then we put other ideas with them, and there's a new creation. So
Hmm.
this book, you have these two islands, Sardinia, and you have that lovely painful story of your day in Sardinia, and I'm back at the hotel or rental house with your wife, thinking, "Oh my goodness."
That's right.
Oh, I have to say something about that too. This is what it reminded me of. Jason, my husband was stationed in Iraq during he was there for Desert Storm and the next Gulf War, but I remember very clearly being on the phone with him one time. And this was just what you did to your wife. You said, I might die. And if I'm still alive in 30 minutes, I'll call you back. My husband, literally on the phone with me, says, uh-oh, I have to go. There's an incoming bomb. There was just an alarm. Click. And I don't hear from him for 48 hours.
Wow.
So I
Wow.
could
Yes.
really, I mean, he was fine. Everyone was fine. It was no big deal. That's why I can laugh about it now. But I can so relate to your wife, as Cindy is saying, when you wrote that in your
Right. Yes. Well, that's
story.
why there might be a delay on the sequel.
He's not
Sorry,
willing to
Cindy.
travel with you.
I didn't mean to interrupt, Cindy. Please continue.
Well, no, I just thought, so the title of the book, on this, why literature still matters, beauty after the apocalypse. And I'm just curious, what made you want to go in this direction? Do you think it was that epiphany of having your whole physical being touched by literature, so to speak?
Yeah, yeah. Well, believe it or not, in my mind, that feels like the upbeat chapter,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and I think that was the sort of the fun and delightful discovery that although no, I didn't want to die of dehydration. Nevertheless, it brought back to an elemental experience of the water and the wind and the heat and the rock and I think that felt to me exactly what I had been seeking my whole life as a reader of literature is this attempt not just to see beauty, but to close the gap, right? As I say in the book, not just to see beauty, but to eat beauty, right? To metabolize it so that that lovely thing out there is not just something that I have to watch as it sorrowfully fades away, but can actually become habituated part of my life. And so that's the upbeat chapter for me. The apocalyptic stuff is the rest of it. It's my analysis of the Zuckerberg letter, but it's also the chapter where I do a variation on a theme, something I love very much in Lewis. That his wonderful insight. What would happen if we began to spend more time around our machines than we did around the natural world? And he thought that what would happen is, and in fact, he thought it was happening, is that our metaphors for how we describe things, including ourselves, would become mechanized. And then when that had become so commonplace, it would sink into our vocabulary. And thus we would begin to secretly feel about the world as if it was a machine and we were machines. And that, of course, that's what I mean by the apocalypse. And of course, it's just been accelerated in our world by a world of technology and what some scholars call the datafication of the selves, right? And I give a couple of really fun examples, I think, from the visual arts, but also from literature. That if you began to metabolize this machine think, right? If it began to get into your air and your blood and your brains, then those texts, especially the old books, right? The great books in the pre-modern world, more or less, we'll say before 1600 AD. That's kind of where Lewis would put that dividing line. But you go back to those old books and they feel slow. Now, I think my argument was it's not because they're slow and it's not because they're boring, but it's because we've been sped up so much that they seem slow in comparison to us. But they weren't made according to this kind of background logic of mechanization. They were made according to a different type of logic. It is a logic I explore in the Lewis book, right? The logic of the icon or the logic of the cathedral, or you could even say the logic of the growing tree. And they work differently. And maybe hopefully your readers will like this. in the pre-modern world, they used to say, this is kind of a strange thing to say, but they used to say that the most beautiful shape, the most perfect shape is the circle. It's kind of a strange thing to say, like, we don't think a circle is necessarily better than a square or a triangle. But they thought that in some sense, what they had hoped to do as a culture was represented by that. That is, every time that there's movement, there's always an attempt to try to bring it back to the center. And for them, the goal was is that even though we live in this temporal world, even though time is passing, right, even though we're always rushing forward, when we have an experience of depth, when we have an experience of beauty, what we want to do is sort of turn it back upon itself. We want to slow it down. In the modern novel Laurus, Vodolaskin, the Russian writer, uses the phrase to spatialize the temporal. They wanted eternity to overcome time, at least to the extent that we mortals could do. And so I think when you begin to recognize, again, it sounds kind of funny, but the spiritual significance of the circle, then you see that in all kinds of pre-modern art before 1600, whether it's Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, right, which tells a little bit of the gospel story, but then pauses with a chorale, right, or an individual solo, and then develops those emotional qualities. It bends itself back like a circle. You find this in the so-called perpendicular architecture in these wonderful English cathedrals. As if you've been to Westminster Cathedral, you see these incredible sort of wood coffered ceilings spiraling out, right? You see this in Spenser, one of Lewis's favorite poets. In other words, if we could kind of diagnose ourselves as, being under the condition of this machine think, right? This plot, which is always sort of bounding forward in acceleration, then we could sort of open our eyes to appreciate some of these older things, which we know our ancestors loved, but we've lost a taste for. But it's not their fault. It's just sort of how history has become. So that's what I mean by the apocalypse. How difficult it has for us to read the old books. But even though I think I say some critical things here and there, hopefully in a good spirit, I'm not discouraged and I'm not depressed, and I don't feel like it's a sort of depressing book, but rather to me it seems like the exciting of it, an exciting opportunity for a new beginning.
I like that because it doesn't come across as depressing. I mean, for me, it wasn't depressing at all. I was like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I feel
Mm.
vindicated. Talking about the Zuckerman letter, and then you go on, you say something so profound. I mean, you start talking about how our language has been put down to six reactions. Like when we're on Facebook, and this is something that I've just gone over and over with people that we don't, when we lose our vocabulary, we don't have the ability to communicate, because when I say I like something and you say you like something, there are so many levels and depths to that we're really not communicating at that point.
Yeah, that's right. I think, again, the difference between a conspiracy theory and a cultural analyst, right, is attributing causation, right? So I don't go into that, but it seems like for whatever reason, right, we are sort of accidentally stumbling into the Brave New World, into 1984, and obviously one of those sort of key features was the sort of reduction of all
Yes.
responses to almost like on a number line, right? Double, double, plus, plus, good. You can go, in the right direction, in the positive direction. It could be like, it was like so super, 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 like amazing. Wow. And I hear my students, my lovely students speaking this way. And then you could go in the sort of negative direction. But the reality is that the human soul is as deep as the world is wide. And if we think of ourselves not in terms of machines, which are trying to amp up the right reaction, but more, you could say, in terms of ecosystems, or if you want, you could say in terms of galaxies or planetary systems, constellations, in which what we need a rich power of virtues and loves balanced and woven together, right? I mean, just think of any individual ecosystem, right? You don't have these mammals if you don't have these types of forests and this type of undergrowth and these types of birds, right? All these sort of, what if the soul is more like that? What if we need not, one or two trending correct opinions, which are constantly being amplified louder and louder and louder? We just got through an election year. We know what this is like, right? But what if we need this rich kind of cosmos of different types of emotions and feelings? And you mentioned it was super fun to do a literary analysis of Mark Zuckerberg's open letter to his daughter Max. Her full name is Maxima. But then compare that to the older poetry. And that's exactly what emerges, is that someone like Yeats feels that he needs towers and myths and animals and beasts and seas and winds and stars to wish. He needs all those rich sort of metaphors to fully express all the complicated the complicated goods that are necessary for a flourishing human heart. Whereas Zuckerberg doesn't seem to know it. And he doesn't seem to even know that he doesn't know. He doesn't seem to know that there's even an alternative. And that's, I think, what is apocalyptic. It's not necessarily that Mark Zuckerberg exclusively analyzes his daughter's well-being as if she were, a mathematical function being graphed out, in an exponential function that he wants to, as the mathematicians say, to vertically stretch, right? It's not just that, but it's that he doesn't seem to notice an alternative. And that kind of like apocalyptic forgetfulness, I think, is what was sort of particularly vexing me and worrying me, and thus to make this sort of strong case for the urgency of old books.
Wow. And as you were just saying that, how far is that from the idea of the circle as perfection? He's exploring
Yeah,
this
this is
function. It's
great.
like it's linear,
That's right. That's
starting
right.
in one place and ending someplace else as the ultimate. And there's
Oh,
no
I love it.
circling back to the good of
Yeah,
the past and recycling that.
that's
Wow.
right. Don and Cindy are the ideal readers, and I'm very grateful for that. But that's exactly something I've sort of played around with, is that if for our ancestors the perfect geometrical figure was the circle, for us, it's the exponential function, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it's in this, it's how our world is built, right? It's how our economy is built. Is that even growth, right? Even velocity, right? Even that linear progression is not good enough for us. It actually has to curve. It has to be exponential, not velocity, but acceleration. And I don't necessarily think that that's bad or that's wrong. I think what's problematic is when that's the only good that we love.
Mm.
And that's what makes me nervous. If it is one good among many, then I think we're actually, as a culture, as moderns, we're sort of bringing something which is special, which we possess, and we're integrating that into the choir of the ages. That to me seems right and just, right? That we do have special gifts and we can bring those to the world. I think the problem is when you think that your special gifts are the only things that matter, and
Mm.
you lack a sense of piety for your elders, and not just the elders who are living, but this long tradition, to just assume that they were ignorant and waiting for us to invent iPhones to tell them how we were, right? That's my problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's such a
Amen.
mystery. There's such a mystery that we ignore in this kind. And I want to say this, until you pointed out the flaws in the letter, it just seemed like a normal modern letter to me. And then when you started, I don't know, tearing it apart, which is not really what you did, but just
Conducting a literary analysis.
yes,
Right. Yeah.
shedding light onto it. It was just like,
Right.
my eyes were open and it was so very obvious what you were saying.
Right. I think that's why that project was so fun, is because, as I mentioned in the book, I read it to my students and I try to, now that I've written about it, sometimes they can see that I've got a trump card and I'm waiting for an opportunity to play it. Right. But I love to sort of read it to them and just sort of deadpan if I can and say, what do you think of that? Because on the surface level, he says everything that you would expect a new parent to say, right? And so what's been strange and unexpected among my students is how cool, how tepid their own emotional response to it has been. And that was for me the original impulse, right? It's like what's missing in this? We sort of feel it missing, but can we put our finger on exactly what it is? And I think that's why that little project was so delightful to do. But I myself couldn't figure out exactly what it was until I had a pivot point, until I'd gone back to some older literature to see, well, in contrast, right? What's the difference in contrast? And that's when bringing that old poem by Yeats really illuminated my own eyes to why the Zuckerberg letter felt so empty.
Mm. Yeah. I mean,
And
you
you
just
wonder you
one
wonder
more
what
time.
kind of books and poetry and things he was exposed to, in addition to the way his mind works very analytically, obviously developing something in technological sphere in the computer realm. But Cindy already mentioned this, that we something we discuss a lot, and I've gotten from her, she's given me the bug on this point, is we've reduced language, especially in children's books, to like monosyllabic words that don't
Mm,
trust the child to grasp poetic
mm,
language. And by doing that, we diminish their ability to think, we reduce their
mm.
imagination, and that's what makes me wonder what types of things Zuckerberg has been exposing his brain to. Was he one of those who was solely invested in the area in which he was specializing and not getting a steady diet of beautiful language and words outside of his area of expertise? Because it certainly sounds like it when you look at his letter.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain he went to Experiment House with Eustace Scrubs, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I bet.
He
Yeah.
didn't read the right books.
Well done. Well done.
No. I just this first chapter, I mean, I was just so enthralled with the whole first chapter. I'm a huge Yeats fan. I
Mm,
love reading his poetry. And then you get to this song, you go through this song, and I
yes.
really, really love that you go through the song. It's Sunshine. What is it called? It's the song is Sunshine by
Yeah. One Republic Sunshine. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
One Republic.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
With their
sorry.
music video too, right?
I
Yeah.
missed like the whole One Republic era. So I didn't know this song, but I
Is
love
not a terrible loss.
no, no, but you read a review of it, and the listener said it has 0% bad words, 0% violence,
Mm,
0% racism, 100% you.
yeah.
And you put that as a phrase, 100% you.
Yeah, that becomes a little bit of a leitmotif, doesn't it?
Mm.
Yeah, 100% you. That's the Rihanna song, which with its nearly 3 billion hits, 400 of which are from me. In fact, I have to say that I think my kids finally discovered that dad's research was interesting when they saw me sitting around with my laptop on the couch listening to Rihanna and taking notes. Like, oh, finally, dad's doing stuff that's of interest. No, but I think isn't that interesting, right? And I think this is something I often tell my students is that we sometimes think culturally speaking that goodness is not being bad, right? If I'm
Right,
not hurting
right.
anyone, then I must be good, right? If I'm um but and I think you see it that sort of implicitly in that statement, right? Well, as long as I'm not hurting anyone, then I can be 100% me and I can just consume as much as possible. And, I can, sort of engorge my subject. But what I sort of, want to kind of flush out there is that kind of hidden, well, not only narcissism, but the hidden mechanization, right? The hidden sort of assumption that the good of life is production and consumption. Right. Now, those are obviously important things of life and necessary parts of a civic community. But if you get to the point that you think that goodness is accelerating in our abilities to both produce and to consume, that's really problematic. And I quote as well this Korean philosopher. I always joke with my student and say, your next favorite Korean philosopher. And they sort of look at each other blankly, trying to remember who the first was, right? But your next favorite Korean philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, right, has this lovely little book on saving beauty. And it's very difficult and it's very provocative. And I don't think he's a believer. I don't think he's a Christian, but I think it's all the more interesting for that reason to see him sort of diagnose the symptoms of our culture. And he sort of meditates on this selfie phenomenon. And what he says is that it's not narcissism, right? It's not that everyone's obsessed with themselves, but it's really a sort of spiritual hunger. And they see a beautiful object and they want, as we've already discussed, and in the terms that I use, to close the gap between the beautiful thing and themselves. They want to draw close to it. And so they take these selfies after selfie after selfie after selfie. The reality is, Byung-Chul Han says, and I go places with this, is that our spiritual hunger is deep enough that we need these other things. We need spiritual realities. We need realities of depth. We need the old poems. We need the old masters. That's what we're sort of craving for. And so for him, the selfie phenomenon is not necessarily narcissism, but it's symptom of a starving soul, because we had to keep doing it again and again and again and again, right? Just as
Mm.
if you eat at a fast food restaurant, almost inevitably you're hungry 17 minutes later, right? And you go right back and eat it all over again. And 17 minutes later, you're hungry again, right? There's the equivalent to sort of spiritual realities and intellectual realities. There are poems which are nourishing, and then there are songs, some of the ones that I analyze and have fun doing, which are fun and tasty. They've almost literally been designed by chemists to be as delicious to the ear as the stuff that we find at the 7-Eleven is delicious to the tongue. But we also know that that after the initial dopamine release of that delicious, chemical product, our bodies are going to be left craving something more. And there's equivalent in the heart and the soul too, isn't there? And yeah, you've already mentioned the sort of children's literature. All of us who have kids and all of us who have spent time reading to the children and reading quality things. I mean, isn't that one of the secrets? This is something my wife and I discovered by accident long ago, that if we didn't like the book, if it wasn't also nourishing to us, the kids wouldn't like it. Right.
Mhm.
And in part, we would try to read it real fast just to get it done because it was ugly. But
Yeah,
if we found things which are obviously appropriate for the level, but also had something elevating, something which didn't immediately evaporate, then we'd
right.
have these sort of amazing experiences with the kids. And that felt to us like, real nutrition, and not just, purchasing something delicious from the 7-Eleven, which is, the flavor's going to be gone in 30 minutes, right?
There he is talking like Charlotte Mason again,
Yeah.
Cindy.
That's what I was going to say. Charlotte Mason talks about education as setting a feast before the kids and then letting them eat that feast. Like we give them the very best. We don't go to 7-Eleven and get the candy bars and the food that, yes, would give us a momentary
Right.
excitement and then be nothing.
I
One of
love that.
the things that disturbs me about children's literature, if you go to any bookstore now and want to buy a book for a child, almost every book is didactic. Every book is, whether
Hmm.
it's a Christian didacticism, like this is how you be good, do this, do that, or ecology or environmentalism, or
Hmm.
just the plain old ABCs. It's just constantly like everyone has an agenda and they want
Hmm.
to get that agenda across to children. And it's just constant on these poor kids with no imagination whatsoever. And, it's not really giving them the tools that they're going to need, which are the metaphors that
Hmm.
they're going to need to understand the world and live in it. And they're going
Hmm.
to just have, it's almost as if we're saying
Hmm.
life is a linear problem. And
Right.
here is an algebra solution for you. Do this, 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 and this. And the world, the environment
That's
will,
right.
it's all up to you. It's just an incredible burden to place upon children from every direction, even from Christians. And I just feel like we need to give the kids a break and just start reading them beautiful stories and let some of these other things take care of themselves.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I was just thinking that, you were mentioning environmentalism, and I was thinking that a poem or a story poem like Shel Silverstein's Giving Tree, in some sense,
Oh,
does makes a point, makes a point about generosity, makes a point in which you feel that, after you read that thing, you'd be more likely to love a forest than not. But it doesn't do it in that sort of didactic way. It does it in a way that sort of, preserves, well, as I said earlier, right? The human soul is as deep as the world is wide. And it seems, even for our kids, we can pay them the compliment that they have deep souls, maybe souls which aren't yet fully formed, but souls that could be. And yeah, just through innumerable, we have 6 kids from 17 to 2, and we've probably spent an hour and a half, or my wife probably even more per day for the past 17 years reading to them. So this is something which is I don't really write about in the book, but it feels like a true extension, and who knows, actually maybe more formative, and even why I wrote the book than I myself consciously knew.
yes, I think so. And one of the things we wanted to talk about was Lewis's rule of thumb of reading an old book for every new book. And you just mentioned something about adults, children not wanting to read a book if an adult is obviously not interested. And if I'm
Hmm.
not mistaken, those two ideas are found in the same Lewis essay, aren't they? In his introduction to Athanasius's On the Incarnation is on the reading
Right.
of old books. And I
Yeah.
think both of those things are included in that. Is that right?
Yeah. I think he's probably imagining slightly older children in that section of sort of high school students, maybe college students. But I know what you're talking about. He says that he's made it his career. And I jokingly call myself the target version of C.S. Lewis, right? I mean, C.S. Lewis is the real deal, and I've got a discount rack of that. But I'm proud to say that I've modeled my own teaching and my own writing and my own career in this. But he said I've made it my career to trying to demonstrate that the old books are more readable than people would expect and more delightful than their textbook reductions. Yeah, so I think analogously, or even with I remember one of my favorite experience was when the big girls were little. They were maybe like 8 and 6, right? Too little to sit down and read Dante's Inferno to, which was what I was writing my
Fair.
dissertation on, right? I was working on Dante's comedy in the day, but it was on my heart, it was on my mind. I felt this kind of drive, this instinct, this compulsion to share it with them in one capacity. So rather than reading it to them, what I would do is I would read one or two Conti each day, one of these little chapters myself. And then when I put them down to bed, I would retell it. I would retell the story. And of course, they
Oh,
listened and they loved it. And I mean, I gave it in a way which was appropriate for a 6 and 8 year old girl, but I didn't spare them the weight and the moral seriousness and the gravity, and that our souls are deep and profound, but are also free and can make profound decisions, right? And profoundly good and profoundly evil, right? And they just loved it. They begged for it every single night. And I remember one night in particular, I was telling the story um, of the vainglorious, right? Those who loved their reputation for holiness more than they loved God. And in Dante's imagination, they had these golden cloaks, right? They're gorgeous on the outside, but they're heavy and weighing them down on the inside. They're lead. And these poor souls feel crushed, right? Because they've lived their lives on the periphery of their being, these kind of public, religious celebrities. And that's all I said. At which point my 6 year old burst into tears. I said, "What's wrong, honey?" She said, "Daddy, it's just so sad."
oh,
And then I
yeah,
thought, okay,
yeah,
we got a definition for a classic. A
yes.
classic is a book that a 35-year-old could write his dissertation on and make a 6-year old girl cry on the same day. Right. But I think we don't have to dumb things down, but
Yes.
we can translate them, right?
Yeah.
We can create what I've become very interested in, this lovely image. We can make icons, right? We can make these sort of participatory images which communicate some of these things at a level which is appropriate for them, right? But also which pays them the compliment that they have deep souls and that this world is wide and beautiful.
That's
Amen.
right. Respecting them as persons, as Charlotte Mason would say. Sorry, Cindy. I
No,
keep,
I just
oh,
you're right, Don. Charlotte Mason says that children are born persons, and we find this all the time. We had one girl that we talked to who was reading The Fairy Queen, and her 3-year-old asked her to read it loud. "What are you reading, Mommy? Could you read a little bit to me?" And she started reading it, and every day he begged and begged and begged for her to read The Fairy Queen to him. And like you say, and
Mm,
that's why your book, while it doesn't touch on children's literature at all, it is telling us why it is so important that we give our kids this heritage of language, these beautiful
mm,
words and thoughts. And I agree, you
yeah,
can retell beautiful stories to your children. And in
right.
many ways, they are often retellings themselves. But
Yeah.
to underestimate our children and think they can't handle it is a terrible mistake, I believe.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because one of my favorite things to say to my students when they say, they get excited about, they get engaged and they want to know about the next steps. They want to know how to have a good, happy family. And for some reason they ask us questions. But what I always tell them is that what we love, we give to our children for free, right? What we love, we give to our children for free. And if you want your kids to play the piano, then you should sign up for piano lessons, right? And as you sort of sit there and go through the chords and have that sort of moment, you go, "Oh, that's what a third inversion is." they're going to toddle over and you can show them what you just discovered, right? And that gets to them for free. And so I think this is something I've seen, a lot, obviously being a parent and among my friends, that we want the best for our kids. We want our kids to have this wonderful and this great education. But maybe what we don't oftentimes think about enough is loving this stuff ourselves. So
Mm.
maybe I think this book sort of fits into what to what you're describing. I sometimes ask my college students, I'll ask like a big class, how many of you have ever seen your parents read a lyric poem for
Mm.
fun?
Mm.
Not in preparation for a homeschooling class, right? I know you've seen, a lot of you have seen your mothers do that, but how many of you seen of one of your parents on a weekend pick up a book and read a lyric poem because it's delightful, right? I think that's got to be an important component of our transmission of education, right? Because that education, I suspect right now I'm quoting Charlotte Mason by accident, right? That education is sort of wrapped up in the gift of love, right? And I think that's a sort of that's one of those essential pre-learning properties. So maybe in that way, this book, you're right, though not about no, not about homeschooling, though not about the classical school movement or any of those types of things, right? Um, if I think if we love literature and if we feel it deep in our bones as a project of great vitality, I think we will, just as you're describing with the Fairy Queen, we will communicate that, and that might even be more effective than whatever ideas that individual ideas that we download, right? Just the
Right.
very model of a soul that's seeking deep nourishment from the old wells.
Yeah.
Careful, Jason. You sounded a little mechanized when you said that you downloaded something.
I do allow myself that metaphor. In fact, my lovely editor tried to persuade me to drop it.
Oh, really? I was
That's
just
right.
teasing.
She said, "Are you sure you want to say we want to download and not to stream?" And I said, "No, please leave it because that metaphor makes a lot of sense to us.
Yes,
And
that's true.
we can get to the natural ones later, but let's start with what we feel." Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is just great. There's just so much going on in this book, and this book is dense with ideas. It's not a long book, but it's very there's just an idea that we could go on and talk about for hours, really, on every page of the book. I love chapter 3 where you talk a lot about surprised by joy. It's just such a beautiful story, and you really bring that up and go through it. So there's just so much going on here. And I know you're a huge fan of Lewis anyway, obviously having written a book about him. And as I mentioned on the Literary Life podcast, gotten Simon Vance to read your book. So
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that great?
yeah, that's amazing. It's just so amazing. Which, but anyway, I'm just curious. As you're going forward now, you have a new Substack right now, Beauty
I do.
Matter, and you go through some of this stuff. You have the picture. So in the book, we have this story of Sardinia. Is it Sardinia? Is that how you
Yeah.
pronounce it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But then on the Substack, you actually have pictures of it, which really make it come alive.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, no. Yes, I launched this Substack Beauty Matters in part because I've been wanting to do this for a while, but I wanted to launch it in coordination with the book because I've begun to think of Beauty Matters as doing in a virtual way what our medieval ancestors tried to do with the manuscript pages, right? That is, very rarely do you find a clean page with this just sort of black and white. But they seem to think that the black lines of the ink, the ideas were almost like furrows dug into the ground. And once they were planted and digested and held within the memory, then they would flower and flourish and burgeon in all of these different sorts of shapes, which become either an illuminated page, or they become these sort of decorations in the margin, or they become the capital letters, or in some cases, in some of these old liturgical books, they become the Gregorian chant markers, the neumes. And so I sort of I imagined my smart readers going along and coming to a reference, say to Mendelssohn's Hebrides, to the overture to Mendelssohn's Hebrides and thinking, huh, what does that sound like again? Sticking their finger in the book and then, trying to like thumb around on YouTube to try to find it. So what I did was I just sort of saved my readers the time and created these footnotes, right? What I call these augmented footnotes or these hyperlinked footnotes, which I think I did a pretty good job. Have all the pictures, but also have the pieces of music and all sort of included. It's not a replacement for the text. The text still stands on its own, but it's complementary to the text. That
Yeah.
if you're sort of reading along and get inspired, or I mean, even in some of the in some of the cases, like I compare Zuckerberg to a piece of classical music, a new classical music by John Adams, right, who wrote an opera about Oppenheimer. And the so-called overture to that is a bunch of machine noises. And it's not, you probably wouldn't want to listen to it more than 18 times, but it's very, very sort of culturally interesting as kind of an illustration for where our culture is and so the sort of the DNA of how it thinks. So I tried to supply all the references for the comparisons that I was making, as well as to the poems, so that my readers could go hunt those things down and think through it in a richer way.
So I'm trying to compare that we have 18 views for Adams and 400 views for Rihanna, and my mind is kind of exploding there and and the dearth for John Adams.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But it,
Well,
but but your
more
Substack is
Snickers, more Snickers bars get sold than pot roast, right?
that's right, that's right. But it is a wonderful companion. I've been enjoying following along after reading some of the sections of the book. So I'm
That's
so glad
awesome.
that you did that.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
And we thought we'd add some of those to our monthly newsletter so that before we study, we can have some of that music in our head and it'll be fun.
Yes. That's
Just
great.
thinking about literature, and I'm maybe putting you on the spot because we didn't have a heads up about this, but especially modern literature. There's so many times I get talked into reading a modern book that everybody loves, and it's really the best. And I say, okay, this one's going to be really good. Especially, I'm talking about fiction, and because I read a lot of really good nonfiction, but
Mm.
the and I have this emptiness when I'm done reading it. And I just finished The Warden by Anthony Trollope. And it's a rambling, kind of silly. There's nothing much happens in the
Mm.
book. And I felt so good at the end of that book that I want to go on and read the next boring little town story that he's going to write about with the people that I recognize and just the richness of
Mm.
life and the truth that's kind of buried in all of that. Why can't we do that? What is happening? Are we doomed?
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you read something like Thomas Hardy, right? And he makes a simple village life. I think it's someone like Thomas Hardy, Owen Barfield, C.S. Lewis's good friend,
Mm.
called Thomas Hardy of basically, or at least Thomas Hardy's literary world was the absolute last vestiges of the pre-modern order that had
Mm.
sort of survived in these funny little pockets of England. I think he felt about that maybe like some of us would feel about Southern writers, right? Flannery O'Connor thought that in some sense the South, jokingly saying, precisely because it hadn't stayed up with the progress of the North, still had sort of preserved some of these interesting connections to an old world order.
Mm.
Um, if you look at, I think a book that I admire a lot, Eugene Vodolazkin's book, Laurus, written relatively recently, he does need the device of writing this kind of historical fiction, this also kind of magical realism about the medieval world. So he has to sort of retreat back to there to give this kind of like nourishing epic world. I think that's a lot of people have talked about that. A lot of people have talked about our disenchanted world because I think what we want is not just sort of, daily occurrences of life, but we want the sort of sense that these higher values, even in our ordinary interactions, are trying to work themselves into our daily lives, into our interactions. And it seems that our ancestors were living in this symbolic cosmos, as we talk about in the Lewis book, right? We're closer to that, so that even their daily lives had this sense of connection to the spiritual depth. I will say though, I think this might be an exciting age for lyric poetry, though. I mean, you mentioned sort of long form fiction, but and I keep meaning to do this, and hopefully I will over the Christmas break, of my favorite contemporary lyric poems. I think precisely as Don was saying earlier, if you're using the Lewis one for one principle, right? An old book for every new one. Some of my readers and some of my students actually need to be told to read the new book, right? They're so good at reading the
Uh,
old books and the old poems, and they love them so much, which I admire, that they also need some things which are closer to our age, right? It depends on who you are, right? Most of us in our culture need a, to supplement our diets with Homer and Virgil, but there are some who need to go the other way around. But I think something like Benjamin Meyer's Field, in which he recycles the vision that Aeneas has in Aeneas 6,
oh.
and sort of has a vision of his own fatherhood, right? And concludes, heaven is a field full of fathers. I know, I have been there. I am one of them. Oklahoma Boy, right?
Huh.
I think Gertrude Schnackenberg, her poem Supernatural Love, about a little girl's love of her father and how that actually reveals something Christological. I think many of Dana Gioia's poems. I'm particularly fond of Winter Solstice, and another poem, Insomnia. Any uh any person who's around my age and has mortgaged walls which creak, can you feel the concerns of your shifting foundations, will enjoy that poem, but also get the significance of that. My friend James Matthew Wilson, I think, just released a book. It's called something like Thomas Aquinas and the Birds. But I think there's sort of a new age in which, here's how I think of it, is that there was a long period of formalism in our poetry, right? In which
Mhm.
we had definite lines, we had definite meters, we had definite shapes, right? Then, of course, there was a sort of modernist flow which tried to create things which were difficult and enigmatic and mysterious. And some of them are goofy, right? Some of them are, trying to get something out of the subconscious, right? Sometimes they're really angry and vile, right? And sometimes they're just silly, right? Then there's another sort of modern movement of the new sincerity, right? This is Billy Collins, and you might not think it's the most profound thing, but you always laugh, and you find yourself reading those types of poems at Thanksgiving. I think we actually might be witnessing a time in which all three of those strands are coming back together, in which some of the best of the depth of modernism and its desire to speak about the soul, and some of the old forms are coming back in the so-called new formalism, right? And yet there's a kind of relatability and accessibility and concern with my lived daily lives and my relationships and my children and my communities. So I think, I hear what you say on the fiction, but in the meantime, we might want to keep our eye on lyric, because it might be about to have a golden age.
Well, I hope
Wow.
so because I am buying your book for Christmas for my son, who is a poet, and he very much fits in the mold of what you are saying, in that sense. Like, he just sent me a beautiful poem. He would probably not be appreciate me saying this, but he has on his grandmother's fudge that he remembered eating, and it's just a very well done poem. I say that, of course, probably slightly prejudiced, but so far his poems have what you're saying. They have some structure, they have some depth, and they also have a lot of that Billy Collins feel of, yes, this has happened to me before.
Yeah, I mean, what a cool time that we can use the sort of poetic microscope, to look at those things which are closest to us in our lived lives.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's, I mean, there are lots of good reasons to be grumpy and depressed, and right, we all know those, right? But then I think for everything we lose, creates these new hungers, creates these new opportunities, and so I am excited about that. And as we mentioned earlier, That's why, even though I do have some criticism, and I do have some tough things to say, and I do talk about our collapsing vocabulary, ultimately I'm not discouraged about it, and I'm not depressed, and I'm excited about the next 10, 20 years of cultural rebuilding.
And this
Yeah.
is why when you talk about the apocalypse, you say you're not being pessimistic about it. And we did not feel that that came across. And you have definitely,
Right.
with this encouragement about lyrical poetry and maybe reaching a renaissance, has been very encouraging.
I know
So
that's a kind of a hot take, isn't it?
yeah, really is.
Yeah, I hope the poets out there don't let me down.
Alex won't. That's Cindy's
Yeah.
poet, and I'm not his mother, so I can say that I also find it very moving and
External
enjoyable.
validation. That's good.
But I also think all of this ties together with like what you're saying about the world that maybe we see a tapestry, like our lives are woven into, God has a way of weaving our lives in ways that are way beyond what we could call the modern way, look of problem solving. Like if you're a Christian, you're just going to get this right. You're going to do this and this and this and this, and that's going to turn, and
Mm,
that's not how life works. And literature sometimes has a way of reaching, like you're talking about Hardy, and showing us the back of the tapestry, all of it falling apart, everything going every which way, and then reminding us somehow that it is a beautiful, God is doing something beyond just the minorness of our own little lives. And that is where the humility comes in. Like, yeah, we're just getting up in the morning and living our lives, and but something mysterious is also going on that we maybe don't understand, but if we have faith, we can believe that there's meaning there, and that there's meaning in our books, there's
yes.
meaning in our lives. So,
Yes. Yeah, I think you've articulated Tolkien's vision and Leaf by Niggle rather beautifully, right? Um, yeah, it's hard for him to see these kind of these grand motifs that are being woven into even his ordinariness.
mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. Did you have anything that you wanted to mention that we failed to bring up?
No, I'm very grateful for this conversation. It's been a real delight. Yeah, I'm very encouraged, and I want to go read books to myself and to my children. But I mean, if your listeners are interested, you can find more information about my books and my writing at jasonmbaxter.com, jasonmbaxter.com. And I also have a link to the Substack Beauty Matters, which has these augmented footnotes, but other articles as well that I'm working on. But yeah, this has been fun. This has been relaxing. This has been ennobling and uplifting. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And all that'll be in our show notes too. So people can go there and
Great.
click on the links if they want, or they can just remember. But if you forget, go to the show notes, and those links will be there. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
ladies.
Jason Baxter says, we know that old things are deep things, and that they are written on the human heart, and that accordingly they emerge, sometimes when we least expect them. Why Literature Still Matters, page 48. Thanks for listening to The New Mason Jar with Cindy Rollins. If you'd like to hear more from Cindy, you can do so at patreon.com, or you can sign up for Cindy's newsletter at morningtimeformoms.com. We will be hosting periodic Q&A episodes in which we feature listener questions. If you have something you would like us to address on the podcast, then please send an email to info@thenewmasonjar.com. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss a future episode. And if you like what you hear, please leave a review to let us know. Until next time, remember, children are born persons, and so are their mamas.